The stench hit first. Not the soft perfume of royal chambers, not the burning candles meant to mask decay, but the unmistakable reek of human flesh surrendering to rot. Those summoned to Edward VI's bedside in the summer of 1553 did not whisper about his illness anymore, they whispered about his smell. A smell so thick and choking that courtiers pressed cloths to their faces, terrified it would cling to their clothes, terrified it would follow them home. And yet, Edward was still alive. This was the boy who had once been hailed as England's miracle, the long-awaited son of Henry VIII. A child whose birth had set off fireworks of celebration, bells ringing across London, and a king brought to tears. But now, at only 15, he was a ruin. His body was collapsing in on itself while his heart still beat, while his lungs still wheezed. He was, as one horrified attendant later confessed in secret, a corpse that had not yet learned it was dead. It began with a cough. A simple cough in winter, nothing unusual for a frail boy. But the cough deepened, became wet, became red. The attendants described handkerchiefs soaked in blood, the boy hacking through nights until his throat tore raw. And with the cough came sweat, not the sweat of fevered exertion, but the cold, endless sweat of a body drowning from within. Edward's frame, always slight, shrank further. His tutors wrote of a once brilliant boy who could speak Greek and Latin now reduced to blank stares, unable to concentrate, his strength leaking away with every breath. His legs swelled grotesquely, skin stretched so thin it cracked and split, oozing a foul discharge. His fingernails blackened, curled, then fell away. His golden Tudor hair came out in clumps, leaving his scalp a raw, blistered landscape. At night, his sheets were soaked, not just with sweat, but with the fluids his body could no longer contain. Servants changed his bedding so often that his chamber reeked like a charnel house. The boy lay in it all, silent except for the rattle of his lungs. Physicians were summoned, but the more they treated him, the worse he became. Bleedings, purges, strange concoctions of herbs and metals, nothing cured, only worsened. His body bore the scars of these desperate remedies, ulcers on his arms and back, seeping sores that never closed, his veins punctured and bruised. Yet what terrified those closest to him was not the sight, but the sound. Edward's breathing filled the palace like a death rattle. It was said you could hear him wheeze from the corridor, a rattling, bubbling gasp that made even hardened courtiers flinch. At times, when he coughed, he spat up more than blood, he spat up pieces. Fragments of lung, chunks of decayed tissue, torn from the inside by the very disease consuming him. Imagine it, the future of England choking on his own dissolving body, drowning slowly in himself. But the kingdom could not know. Not yet. The machinery of Tudor politics demanded silence, demanded lies. Courtiers who whispered about the king's state risked prison. Letters to foreign ambassadors spoke of recovery, even as Edward could barely lift a hand. When visitors were admitted, the boy was dressed in fine robes and propped up with cushions, his corpse-like face powdered to hide the greenish hue of his skin. Those who stood close enough, however, could smell the truth. His breath, described by one attendant, reeked of rotting meat and sweet corruption. His lips bled when he tried to smile. And when he signed documents, his hands, grotesquely swollen from edema, could barely clutch the quill. When death finally came, it was not gentle. Edward's body spasmed, his chest rattled one last time, and then silence. But the horror did not end there. For Tudor custom demanded an autopsy, and what the royal physicians found inside was so revolting they sealed the coffin almost immediately. The liver was yellow-green, soft as wax, disintegrating at a touch. The heart, swollen and scarred, pitted with lesions. His bowels, inflamed and ulcerated, leaked a blackened fluid. But it was the lungs, the very seat of his agony, that made hardened surgeons recoil. They were riddled with cavities, hollowed out like rotting wood. Pockets of foul-smelling pus burst open as the chest was opened, spilling across the floor. The physicians wrote, in words meant never to be spoken aloud, the boy had rotted within himself. Even embalming could not disguise it. The stench was so powerful, so overwhelming, that the body decayed faster than any Tudor monarch before him. The coffin was sealed in haste, guarded, hidden from sight. England's miracle son, Henry VIII's dream, had died not only young, but unfit even for display. Edward VI did not simply fade away. He collapsed, day by day, layer by layer, as if his own flesh had turned traitor. His skin erupted first. Angry ulcers spread across his back, his arms, even his face. They festered into open sores that oozed pus, releasing a stench so foul servants gagged as they tried to clean him. The wounds refused to heal. Instead, they widened, splitting open like cracks in crumbling stone. By June, Edward's once pale Tudor complexion had become a patchwork of yellow pus, black scabs, and greenish streaks of decay. His hair began to desert him. Thick tufts came away on his pillow, in the comb, in the hands of those who dared touch him. Within weeks his scalp was more blister than skin, raw, weeping, impossible to conceal. And still the fluids poured from him. Night after night, his mattress was soaked through, sweat, blood, pus, and worse. Servants hauled away the sodden bedding so often that courtiers whispered he produced more filth than a dying animal. The chamber, no matter how many candles were burned, no matter how much incense was thrown onto the fire, reeked like a grave that had been opened too soon. Then came the teeth. One by one, they loosened in their sockets, gums darkened and receded, the infection spreading through his mouth. He could no longer chew meat, then no longer chew bread, and finally could not even swallow broth without coughing it back up mixed with blood. His lips cracked and bled when he tried to speak, so he stopped trying. The brilliant boy who once sparred with scholars in Greek and Latin had been reduced to whispers no one could hear, his voice strangled by pain and exhaustion. And yet, the treatments continued. The physicians bled him until he was weak as water. They purged him with concoctions that left him writhing, his bowels emptying in violent torrents that only deepened his dehydration. They forced down mixtures of metals, herbs, and oils that seared his throat and inflamed his stomach. The so-called cures did not heal, they tortured. Every remedy inflicted new wounds, new pain, new ways for his body to betray him. Imagine it, a king not just devoured by disease, but by the very hands sworn to save him. Edward was not dying in silence. He was being consumed, piece by piece, from the inside out. But behind the chamber doors another horror was unfolding. Everyone at court could see the boy was lost. His greenish skin, the rattle in his chest, the stench of rot, all screamed that death was days, perhaps hours, away. Yet to admit this was treason. For if Edward died, his Catholic half-sister Mary would inherit the throne, and the Protestant cause would collapse overnight. So the whispers of truth were smothered. The reality of Edward's rotting body was denied. Letters to foreign courts spoke of improvement. Proclamations praised his recovery. While the boy king wasted into a living corpse, England's future dangled on a lie. And in the shadows of his sickroom, powerful men began plotting how to gamble with his corpse before it was even cold. Edward's body was falling apart, but the lies around him were just beginning to take shape. And those lies would outlive him. The boy king was decomposing in plain sight, and yet England was told he was recovering. It was a performance, a grotesque theater in which Edward VI became both actor and victim. When foreign ambassadors requested an audience, they were admitted to a chamber transformed into a stage. Curtains were drawn to hide the shadows of death. Candles and perfumes burned furiously to mask the odor, though they only added a sickly sweetness to the air. And then Edward himself was revealed, dressed in finery, his frail body propped upright with pillows, his face powdered so heavily it resembled a death mask more than living flesh. He was a skeleton king, a wax figure animated just long enough to fool the eyes of visitors. But those who stood close enough could see the truth. The greenish pallor beneath the powder. The dark sores creeping up his neck. The trembling hands barely able to lift in greeting. And above all, the smell. One ambassador wrote, in a letter so carefully coded it would not be deciphered for years, of a chamber that stank of sweet rot, and a boy whose breath was a herald of the grave. Still, the deception went on. Behind this theatre, the Dudley faction, led by John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, clung to desperate hope. They knew Edward's death would mean the throne passing to his Catholic half-sister Mary. For them, that was unthinkable. So even as the boy's body betrayed him, they pressed him into action. Swollen, ulcered hands were forced around a quill to sign legal documents, the infamous device for the succession. Edward's fingers, grotesquely puffed by edema, could barely grip the pen. The ink blotted, his script faltered, yet the pressure was relentless. Write, sign, secure the future. Imagine the agony of a boy who could hardly breathe, whose lungs rattled with each movement, being compelled to scratch his name onto parchments that would decide England's fate. It was not governance. It was exploitation. A dying child transformed into a tool, his corpse-like body weaponized in a desperate political gamble. Meanwhile, whispers circulated beyond the chamber walls. Private letters, hidden dispatches, coded messages between ambassadors began to tell a different story, that the king's skin was the color of bile, that his body leaked corruption, that death's shadow walks beside him. No matter how carefully the Tudors masked the stench with incense or disguised his face with powder, the walls of secrecy were cracking. The illusion could not hold. And then, the inevitable. Edward's body could take no more. His collapse was complete. When Edward finally died, the truth could no longer be disguised. But the horror was only beginning. The last days of Edward VI were not peaceful. They were a drawn-out execution carried out by his own failing body. By July 1553, the boy could no longer rise from his bed. His limbs twitched uncontrollably, spasms rippling through wasted muscles. His chest rose and fell in jagged bursts, each breath rattling like water trapped in a broken pipe. Courtiers standing outside the chamber doors claimed they could hear it, the bubbling, suffocating gasp of a king drowning inside his own lungs. Servants prayed aloud, whispering pleas for mercy. But their prayers were drowned by the sound of Edward's agony. He clutched at his throat as if trying to pull the air into himself, his eyes bulging with terror as the disease squeezed tighter. Eyewitnesses would later confess that it looked less like illness, and more like slow strangulation. The boy who had once been the hope of a dynasty was now a spectacle of suffering. His lips were blackened, his tongue swollen, his skin stretched tight over bone. One attendant later wrote that his gaze was already half in the grave. And then it came, the final moments. Edward convulsed, his chest rattled one last violent time, and a gush of blood spilled from his mouth onto the sheets. Then silence. A silence so heavy that even the most hardened courtiers froze in place. The miracle son of Henry VIII was dead at just 15 years old. But instead of mourning, panic filled the chamber. The machinery of politics turned immediately. How could they announce his death without admitting the grotesque truth of his decline? How could they display his body when it had already begun to betray them long before his final breath? The answer came quickly: they would hide it. Lock the truth away behind proclamations of dignity, behind words of faith and ceremony. But Edward's corpse would not cooperate. They thought death would hide the truth. But when his body was opened, even seasoned physicians recoiled in horror. What happened next is one of the most disturbing royal autopsies in history. If you're gripped by this story so far, make sure you stay with Tale of History, where we uncover the truths that kings tried to bury. Because what the surgeons found inside Edward's spoiled body was so revolting, they sealed his coffin in terror. Death should have brought silence. But with Edward VI, it only opened a new chapter of horror. It was rare for a Tudor monarch to undergo a full post-mortem examination. Yet Edward's body was in such a state that the physicians demanded it. Embalming was necessary, not to preserve him for honor, but to stop his spoiled flesh from overwhelming the palace with its stench. The surgeons prepared their knives. Witnesses described them hesitating, as though even they feared what waited beneath the skin. The first incision was made across the chest, the blade sliding into cold, swollen flesh. Immediately, foul gases hissed out, a wave of stench so powerful men gagged and covered their faces. When the ribcage was opened, the true horror began. They examined the liver first. What should have been a firm, dark organ crumbled beneath their touch. Instead of deep red, it had turned a sickly yellow-green, its edges soft and disintegrating. One surgeon wrote later that it dissolved like wax before the fire. The heart was next. The very symbol of kingship, of courage, of power. But Edward's heart betrayed him too. It was enlarged, swollen, and pitted with lesions, cavities eating into the flesh of the organ that should have sustained him. The surgeons prodded, and the tissue collapsed, as if moth-eaten. And then they reached the bowels. Ulcerated, raw, and leaking a foul black fluid that stained the floor. The odor was unbearable, a mix of rot and corruption that forced attendants to flee the room. This was no ordinary embalming, it was a battle against a body that seemed determined to advertise its own decay. Each organ revealed ruin. Each cut confirmed that Edward had not been poisoned from without, but consumed from within. But the worst discovery was still waiting. His lungs. The very place where his agony had begun. But it was his lungs that revealed the true nightmare inside Edward VI. You're watching Tale of History, where we bring to light the darkest truths rulers tried to bury. And what Edward's surgeons found when they cut into his lungs is almost too revolting to believe, yet it's the detail that haunted Tudor England forever. Stay with me. The surgeons had seen enough to turn their stomachs, a crumbling liver, a heart scarred with lesions, bowels leaking corruption. But nothing prepared them for what lay inside Edward VI's chest. The lungs. The organs that had rattled and gasped in his final hours. The seat of his torment. When the surgeons cut deeper and pulled back the ruined flesh, a gasp went through the room. What should have been soft, pink sponges of life were instead riddled with holes, hollowed out like rotting wood. Cavities gaped where tissue had dissolved entirely, leaving only the memory of lungs. The physicians probed the surface, and their fingers sank into empty spaces, collapsing chambers that should have been filled with breath. Then came the pus. The first incision unleashed it, thick, yellow-green sludge that poured out onto the table. But that was only the beginning. As the physicians pressed and opened the remaining tissue, pockets of pus burst one after another, exploding with wet pops that echoed in the silent chamber. The foul liquid spattered across the table, dripping onto the floor, staining the surgeons' aprons. The stench that followed was so overpowering that several attendants turned away, gagging violently, their stomachs rebelling against the spectacle. One physician compared the ruined organs to a sponge left too long in filthy water, eaten through by worms, collapsing at a touch. Another said it was as if the lungs had liquefied themselves, rotting from the inside until nothing solid remained. Every cut only confirmed what Edward's suffering had already foretold: he had drowned not in water, but in his own dissolving flesh. The embalmers tried to proceed. They stuffed the chest cavity with spices, with herbs, with strong-smelling resins. But the rot overpowered everything. No perfume, no incense, no cloth soaked in vinegar could disguise the stench of death spilling from Edward's body. It was too strong, too deeply woven into his ruined form. The air in the chamber grew heavy, suffocating. Even men hardened by decades of brutal medicine struggled to remain at their task. These were surgeons who had seen battlefield wounds, plague corpses, executions gone wrong, and yet here, in the presence of a boy king's spoiled body, they faltered. Witnesses later whispered that some even fled the room, unable to continue. Edward's lungs had betrayed him in life. And now, in death, they betrayed him again, advertising his rot to everyone in attendance. The truth was undeniable: this was not the body of a king who could be displayed with dignity. This was a body too ruined, too foul, to be paraded before a grieving nation. And soon, the problem grew larger than the surgeon's table. Even after the organs were removed, even after the herbs were packed in, the stench remained. It clung to the coffin, to the walls, to the very air. The boy who had been England's great hope now threatened to disgrace the monarchy itself simply by decaying. The horror could not be hidden. And soon, Edward's coffin itself became a problem. You're watching Tale of History, where we uncover the most disturbing truths the past tried to bury. What happened to Edward's coffin was almost as shocking as the autopsy itself, a desperate attempt to contain a body that refused to stay quiet. Stay with me, because the cover-up that followed shows just how terrified the Tudors were of their rotting prince. The surgeons closed Edward's body as best they could, stuffing the hollow chest with herbs and spices, sewing the skin with rough stitches. But even in death, he refused to be silenced. The rot was too advanced, the corruption too deep. His corpse decayed faster than any Tudor monarch before him. Within days, the first signs appeared. The wooden coffin, meant to hold him in dignity until burial, began to weep. Dark fluid seeped through the seams, staining the floor beneath. The stench that had filled his chamber now spread into the corridors of Greenwich Palace. Guards stationed nearby gagged, wrapping cloths over their faces, yet still the odor clung to them. It clung to their clothes, their hair, their very skin. Something had to be done. Orders came swiftly. The coffin must be sealed, and sealed completely. Pitch was brought in, hot and black, poured over the wood to stop the leakage. Sheets of lead were hammered across the seams, each strike ringing through the palace like a desperate prayer. Attendants worked in silence, sweat pouring down their faces, as if they feared the body itself might rise against them. But the sealing did not stop the stench. It only trapped it, building pressure inside until the coffin swelled slightly, as though Edward's body was still fighting to escape. Servants whispered of hearing faint creaks, of catching sudden waves of odor strong enough to make them reel backward. The boy king was dead, yet his decay seemed alive, restless, impossible to contain. The council ordered the coffin never be opened again. No viewing, no public display. England would not see its miracle prince laid out in state, because the truth of his body was too grotesque to risk. Instead, proclamations spoke of dignity, of holy rest, of a blessed departure into God's mercy. But the guards who kept watch knew better. They stood beside a sealed box that reeked like a charnel pit, and they prayed their shifts would end quickly. Of course, secrets never stay buried, not even when sealed and lead. Rumors spread through the court, then through the streets of London. Whispers of poison, whispered even louder of divine punishment. Some said God had struck Edward down for his father's sins, for the blood spilled by Henry VIII in his lust for a son. Others claimed Mary, his half-sister, had somehow cursed him, paving her path to the throne. And still others whispered that the boy had rotted because he was never meant to rule at all. The truth was far simpler: tuberculosis, infection, and the merciless decay of a fragile body. But the Tudor state could not admit that their great hope, the child for whom kings had killed and queens had died, had been undone by nature itself. So the coffin was sealed, the truth buried, and the lie of dignity carefully maintained. Yet the smell could not be disguised, and the whispers only grew louder. The boy who was supposed to save the Tudors had become their most shameful secret. This is Tale of History, where we bring you the stories kings tried to erase. Edward VI's coffin may have been sealed in pitch and lead, but the whispers around his death still escaped, and they would haunt the Tudor dynasty long after his body was laid to rest. Stay with me as we uncover how Edward's legacy of rot shaped the future of England. When the coffin was finally sealed, when the palace halls were scrubbed and fumigated, when the stench of Edward's spoiled body was contained as best it could be, the physicians gathered their notes. They knew what they had seen, what they had touched, what had stained their hands. It was not poison. It was not sorcery. It was not divine lightning striking a boy down. The autopsy proved it. Edward VI was devoured by disease, tuberculosis tearing through his lungs, infection spreading through his blood, malnutrition and frailty leaving him no strength to fight. His body had been doomed long before his crown ever touched his head. And here lies the cruelest irony of all. Henry VIII had sacrificed everything, his wives, his friends, even his faith, to secure a son. He had broken with Rome, split Christendom, and spilled rivers of blood in his obsession with a male heir. And what was the result? A boy whose body betrayed him, whose flesh turned traitor, whose reign ended before it began. Edward VI became more than a corpse. He became a symbol. His rotting body was not just the story of one boy's suffering, but of the fragility of the Tudor dynasty itself. A dynasty born of defiance, built on executions and broken oaths, now brought low by the slow decay of its promised future. Contemporaries recorded their horror in whispers and private letters. Ambassadors described the stench, the secrecy, the terror of servants forced to sleep near the leaking coffin. Courtiers spoke of pity for the boy, and fear for themselves. If even England's chosen heir could rot alive before their eyes, what did that mean for the kingdom? For God's favor? For the fate of England itself? Edward's story spread, not through proclamations, but through rumor and memory. And memory was more powerful than any decree. He was remembered not as the scholar king who spoke in Latin and dreamed of reform. Not as the child whose birth was celebrated with bonfires and bells. But as the boy who dissolved into pus and stench, the king whose corpse could not be shown to his people. The king who was hidden, sealed away, erased. And that is Edward VI's legacy. Not triumph. Not power. But rot. Edward VI was not only the boy king who never ruled. He was the boy king who rotted alive, and even in death, was too foul for England to face. You've just walked through the chambers of Tudor horror with me, through the stench, the lies, the coffin that leaked England's shame. If you want to go deeper into the disturbing histories the world tried to bury, this is the place. Subscribe to Tale of History, where every story uncovers another hidden corpse in the past. The Tudors tried to silence Edward's decay. But here, the truth will always be told.